Welcome to the Montana Wild Bison Restoration Coalition's interview with Montana's hunting conservationist Jim Posewitz, bringing wild bison home to our public lands. Jim Posewitz moved to Montana and earned a Bachelor and Master's of Science degree in Fish and Wildlife Management from Montana State University. From 1961 through 1993, Posewitz worked for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, finishing as the special assistant to the director. After retiring in 1993, Jim founded Orion, the Hunters Institute, dedicated to wildlife conservation and the heritage of hunting and hunter ethics. As a result of his passionate conservation, Jim was a member of and worked with numerous advocacy groups across Montana to promote the value of hunting and hunting heritage as an important element in the wilderness debate. Believing our task is to pass this conservation ethic on to another generation, to keep it alive in people, Jim stated, "We will not keep the ethic alive if we separate or price the people from participation. The public trust we hold dictates that we resist efforts to privatize or commercialize public resources." To share his public trust values now and for future generations, Jim authored 5 books: Beyond Fair Chase, Inherit the Hunt, Rifle in Hand, Taking a Bullet for Conservation, and his recent book, My Best Shot. In an October 13, 2011 article, Bringing Back the Bison, Group Pushes Reintroduction to Montana Public Lands, Brett French wrote, quote, "Jim Posewitz is confident he will see a huntable herd of free-roaming wild bison somewhere in Montana in his lifetime. We'll have to hurry, though," Pos said, smiling. Posewitz is 76. A Montana conservationist, hunter, author, and promoter of hunter ethics, Posewitz has lent his voice to have bison restored to the 1.1 million acre Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Montana. "What better place, what better species, and what better time," Pos said.
My name is Jim Posewitz. I live in Helena, Montana, and in 1 month I will be 85 years old. So, where did I get an interest in conservation and outdoor history and things of that nature? Well, I happen to be a Depression baby. I was born in the middle of the Dust Bowl and the dirty 30s. When we were suffering from economic depression and an environmental disaster of significant proportion. I wasn't aware of that at my birth, but it wasn't long. In fact, it was a matter of months, if you look at the dates, when a great dust storm blew off of the Great Plains. And I was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, on the west shore of Lake Michigan. That dust storm dumped millions of tons of soil on Chicago, which was just to our south. It covered Washington, D.C., and it coated the decks of ships 300 miles out into the Atlantic. So when I was howling for my diaper change, I was sucking in the prairie because the air was full of it across the entire nation. It was one of the natural disasters coupled with an economic disaster that produced an interesting book by an author named Timothy Egan, and the title of the book is The Worst Hard Times. That's my starting point. Summer of 1951, we borrowed when the camp closed, we borrowed the canoes, and we went to my first wilderness adventure, which was north of the boundary waters into Canada. for a week on a canoe trip. It's been an interesting life, and it's been centered on the idea of conservation. I get a chance to go to Montana State College on a scholarship. I follow that calling, and they had a course in fish and wildlife management. And in 4 years of undergraduate school and later after military service, 2 years in graduate school, I never got one credit hour in history, philosophy, or ethics. And yet that is subject material that is at the core of what I would ultimately do with the rest of my life. And I missed it all in college, which to me is a great diversion, and kind of ignoring what it takes in a democratic society to pull off a pretty remarkable feat. And that remarkable feat is to take a nation that was once described as having a wildlife resource on its Great Plains, Montana part of America, that for variety and abundance exceeded anything the eye of man had ever looked upon. We reduced it down to a boneyard, and then we put it back. And we're right one step short of the summit of that restoration effort, and that one step is wild buffalo. I had no idea on the historical route of wildlife conservation and then restoration in North America. And here I went out into the field to become a part of that saga. And it took me a long time to get oriented to what mattered and how we could affect the restoration of wildlife that was just underway. The whole idea of wildlife conservation, you can find little tidbits or fragments of it in Montana history and in North American history. So when Montana was being settled as a territory, the allocation of fish and wildlife was pretty much unresolved. The U.S. Constitution does mention fish and wildlife. The Bill of Rights do not mention fish and wildlife. And we were kind of set free in this democracy of our New World democracy to figure out who would own the wildlife and how we would relate to wildlife ultimately. This gets reflected early, like in as early as Montana territorial years. And we have to remember we were being settled from old Mother England originally. And in Mother England, the king owned the deer. The king owned everything. And in that capacity, there were some brutal laws that punished poachers for taking any of the king's deer. In fact, under King Canute, the game law for King Canute prevented people from hunting on the king's land on the penalty of death. And William I, he enforced the laws that were based on the European code with punishments ranging from death to mutilation. Bender quotes the following as an example of savage penalty. Whoever shall kill a stag, a wild boar, or even a hare shall have his eyes gouged out. So there was a constant war between the peasants and the royalty about access to wild things. And as early as 1876, Montana was struggling with our relationship with wildlife. Actually, it dates back to 1864. Our very first territorial legislature James and Granville Stewart put through a bill through the territory, and the bill restricted fishing to a hook and line. Now, the significance there, I think, of this 1864 action, there was signs that there was a conservation ethic in the people.
In Jim Posewitz's op-ed on January 31st, 2020, Groups Help Bison When Others Slow to Act, he stated, "Wildlife in America is a public resource anchored in our Declaration of Independence and delivered to our generation through the court system, defined as a public trust. The same document that declared all men to be free and equal also declared that we would all share the fish and wildlife of the American commons. At times, our public trustee was negligent in its responsibility to protect our wildlife resource, and citizens formed nonprofit conservation organizations to fill the gap. With buffalo, it was quite dramatic. In 1876, unrestrained commercial extremists shipped 80,000 buffalo hides down the Missouri River from Fort Benton alone. 8 years later, those shipments dropped to zero, and a handful of the last wild buffalo remained in Yellowstone Park. Montana was the wildlife boneyard of North America."
Theodore Roosevelt had a penchant for reform, and he was exercising that as governor of New York, and a lot of it was conservation oriented. He had come home from the prairie after being wiped out by the blizzard of '86, but after hunting and killing that one buffalo and then watching the plains simply rot away, with the remains left behind by the hide hunters and those out simply just to slaughter the buffalo to the last one. They came remarkably close. 8 years after the buffalo hide shipments out of Fort Benton peak at 80,000, that was in 1880 or 1876. By 1884, Theodore Roosevelt had shot one buffalo in '83 because it's all he could find amidst the rotting carcasses of the last big slaughter. The rotting carcasses are cleaned up a little later, and they're cleaned up because you could get $7 a ton for bone to be pulverized into fertilizer to accommodate the busting open of the prairie for agriculture. So there's a huge transition going on, and there's a handful of people that are in non-government organizations that hang on to this idea that we don't have to live without wildlife, that we can have a sporting code, that the game code, the brutal game codes of old Europe can be laid aside because the people in this new world democracy, the people are the sovereign. And so the game is held in trust for the benefit of the people by the states to be managed as a public trust. It was a sloppy start because during that era is when we were cleaning up the last of the buffalo and still basically having unregulated killing of wildlife all across North America. And when Theodore Roosevelt introduces conservation, it's for the big game. He leaves office with 5,000 elk hanging out in our most remote and wild places. One generation later, he's replaced by Franklin Roosevelt. And he introduces wildlife management as a science and funds it as paid for by the hunters and anglers with fees on equipment. And that 5,000 elk that TR leaves behind triples while Franklin Roosevelt is in the office. And so we wind up with 15,000 plunging into the dark times of the dirty 30s. Franklin Roosevelt's programs start taking effect, and the 15,000 elk that he leaves us has now grown to, by a factor of beyond 10, to beyond 100 and around 170,000 elk in Montana alone, and their redistribution into other parts of the country. So wildlife restoration, wildlife management, wildlife conservation paid for by the participants worked pretty well. We've restored and solidified a lot of species, and the most dramatic of course, the saga was the fate of the buffalo. And here we stand one step short of wild, free-ranging buffalo. And what happens again? The government is sort of mesmerized into inaction. But we just got to go one more step and get them onto other blocks of public land where suitable. The Fish and Game, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department has been sitting on an environmental analysis of that for a number of years now without taking action. And I see they just got the green light to put her out for public review, and let's take a shot at it. The ownership of wildlife is consistent within the boundaries of the state of Montana to be managed as a public trust for the benefit of all the people, not for an individual, but for everyone. What we are experiencing in wildlife across the board, and already experiencing it in buffalo, but across the board, the restoration of wildlife again attracts the commerce in wildlife. The same commerce that destroyed them the first time around, we find irresistible to go and start marketing them. And marketing, the people's game, requires the privatization of wildlife. And that tips us back into the rule of kings, where everything is private. And that is sort of the contemporary battle of the day for a wide variety of species. Now, private organizations have combated that and continue to combat it. These are non-government agencies critical of the trustees' casual attitude towards somebody profiting from the presence of wildlife. Because when somebody profits, then a lot of somebodies get eliminated. And the beauty of the North American wildlife restoration model is that it belongs to everybody. We all benefit, and we all get to enjoy it. And that was, I guess, not easy, but it was doable when we were in the trash heap, when we were coming out of the boneyard era. You know, just the very sight of a game animal excited people and was satisfying to them. But as it became more and more abundant, more efforts were made to privatize and commercialize it, and the trustee was sometimes casual about that. And it wasn't the commercial interest that restored it. It was private interests, not the NGO movement. So absolutely critical to the conservation history of America. They formed to introduce conservation, They formed to invigorate conservation in the middle of the dirty 30s, and they proliferate in the environmental movement of the 70s for two reasons. One is a livable environment for wildlife is a quality environment for man. And that was a great byline of the Montana Outdoors magazine, of the Fish and Game Department at the time. And there's considerable combat went on in that era to see this state agency stepping forward and stepping out and challenging the political system that has always been content to stimulate commerce. It's essential to their lifeblood. And when it gets into wildlife, it becomes a combative area again. And that's what we're dealing with out there today. They try to find a way to privatize and commercialize. I mean, it's one thing to post your property and protect your property from trespass. And everybody's in agreement with that. You own private property, that's your right. But you don't necessarily have the right to sell the people's game. And that's what's going on. And that's sort of the battle of the day. But it's a battle over abundance. Missing out on the battle was the buffalo. The buffalo then legislatively gets a dual status as wild and as domestic. And so domestic herds have sprung up in lots of different places.
In another op-ed Jim Posewitz penned on April 7, 2014, Time to Return Bison to the Wild. Today we observe the 150th anniversary of both Charlie's birth and Montana's birth as a territory. We also live with a restored wildlife abundance that is by any measure among the greatest environmental achievements in human history. Everything Charlie painted is back out there in the wild, except one species. Today, nothing prevents us from finishing the saga of wildlife restoration, except the cultural will just to simply do it.
Charlie Russell Game Range, which is considerable available empty habitat that could accept and nurture a truly wild herd of the bison. Now, if you look back at the full length of the width of the 19th century, when George Custer battled the native hunters, it was to affirm manifest destiny, which was a theory, a slogan, or a bumper sticker before we had bumpers, that argued that the Europeans were destined to rule everything. And they, native peoples and their buffalo had to get out of the way. When you look at the issue of why Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has not been more aggressive in the restoration of bison, you have to go back to a period of reformation, political reformation that occurred in the latest year of the 60s and the early years of the 1970s, to make every department head a political appointee. Prior to that time, Fish and Game Department directors, or the head of the agency, was hired as a state employee by the Fish and Game Commission. And the commission, the governor got to appoint, but the department was run by a director who was hired by the commission and thus could not be removed from office except for just cause. And at that time, we were quite aggressive in defending and expanding the base of fish and wildlife habitat protection. We then had the first political appointee, and he turned out to be a pretty good guy. In fact, he was a real good guy. He carried on the Fish and Game fundamental public trustee mission without ever mentioning those words, but he represented that direction, because we were never taught those words or where they came from, that we were a public trustee and we had to manage this for the benefit of all the people. That was avoided in our college training, where there was no orientation going into the agency, but there was a direction that the agency had brought with it. We were determined to remain independent as an agency, and of course, that starts this long transition of political appointees then, and gradually erodes the independence, I think, of the agency. It's not too long that I'm out of there. And one of the first immediate things they did was to break up my unit, which was Ecological Services Division that fought all these resource battles. And that changed the culture there. When we were in those battles, we constantly went out on public education. We had said the agency had 7, still does, information officers, but they were selling conservation, they were selling protection, they were selling preservation, and things that the critters needed. And I think they're still doing that to a degree, but the edge is off. Well, I think a perfect example is the Buffalo EIS. Here it was written, it was going to go out for a public review, laid for years, and just now is getting resurrected as the incumbent governor is nearing the end of his term. And so I expect a bit of chaos in looking for a way to fulfill our public trustee responsibility of recovering buffalo in available habitat for the benefit of all the people, period. And then we have the ironical action of the U.S. Congress declaring them our national mammal. Here's our national mammal, more abused by government than any other wildlife out there. And we have answers that are better. They've already spelled it out. It's in their EIS. They know what to do. They know how to do it. We've done it in everything from grizzly bears to cottontails. And the buffalo, of course, has become symbolic. What the state might do to facilitate the restoration of bison to the Great Plains is, of course, to become the advocate for the bison and not the bystander, and to begin advocacy by launching into a major public information campaign that focuses on the fact that the American Prairie Foundation is demonstrating to us that it can be done. You know, that they can avoid the disease, which is one of the reasons often put forward, and they can adequately fence them, although that'll take maintenance, but that can be done. And I think we should target the C.M. Russell for step 1 to launch a similar demonstration in that pattern. The prairie's there, and it's waiting for the dominant mammal that has been there since time began.
Jim Posewitz wrote in an op-ed March 4th, 2019, "Bison measure is an epic embarrassment to state. One feature making our democracy great is the fact that wildlife in America is a public resource managed by the states for the public. Montana has done pretty well with the restoration of elk, deer, moose, and all other large game. However, when it came to bison restoration, neither the state nor the federal government can generate the will to do it. People in our democracy have often taken this step on behalf of wildlife when the trustee faltered. Now comes one of the final steps, restoring wild bison. Declared our national mammal on April 27, 2016, by the U.S. Congress and President of the United States. In Montana, official holders of the public trust stand silent while the Montana legislature quivers in fear of adding this final piece to the wildlife restoration saga. For a state that has been the leader of wildlife restoration, this is an epic embarrassment to endure as this American saga nears the finish line. Our national mammal has been through a lot. In the 1980s, game wardens and park rangers led shooters to kill every bison that set a hoof into Montana. While that practice was mercifully terminated, bison can still lay claim as the most harassed public wildlife on Earth. They are currently subjected to hazing, chasing, herding, prodding, poking, pinning, and sent to slaughterhouses. The irony is that this treatment is being delivered by agencies created to be the custodian of our precious wildlife resources. The bison has endured enough. This is an animal that is the Department of Interior's mascot since 1849, on the National Park Service's logo since 1951, the national mammal since 2016, and whose skull was engraved on the official Montana quarter in 2007. It is time to do the right thing for the bison. That's my 2 bits worth, Paz said.
I'm Jim Bailey, coordinator of the Montana Wild Bison Restoration Coalition. On July 3rd, 2020, Jim Posewitz passed on to his own happy hunting ground. Restoring public trust wild bison to the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge would be a fitting tribute to his life and his memory.